talking a bit this morning about the child's experience of being in church, particularly preschool children, very small children, which means that for the next 20 to 25 minutes I'm going to be talking mostly about Maria Montessori, this lady. She was an educational philosopher and practitioner who, as you can see, died in the 1950s. And a lot of what she wrote affects the way we do preschool education, in fact education in general, but particularly preschool education today. A lot of it comes from Montessori's work, but if we just click one more time, as you can see, she was sort of contemporaneous with Freud. So at the same time that Freud was starting to identify about how childhood experiences affect adult emotional health, Montessori was identifying that actually the emotional and physical well-being of a child when they're in an education setting affects how much they learned. And not only how much they learnt, but also how they developed into emotionally stable, secure adults who were self-aware and able to contribute to society. But one of the big problems we have in the UK church is that in the last century, particularly in the last half century, whilst the classroom environment, the preschool environment, and the way that we do education for those children has really, really just changed so dramatically, the way we deal with children of that age bracket in church hasn't changed at all, or very, very little. And so it's now very difficult for a parent such as me to explain to my preschooler why the way he has to engage and interact and behave at church is so different to what he would be expected to do at nursery with his childminder in that kind of setting. So we're going to look at Montessori's theories in two main areas. Firstly, her understanding of the child, why she wrote what she wrote, what it was that she could see in children that really changed the way we began to educate and rear them, and how that fits in very much with the biblical model of the child and is therefore really relevant for us as Christian practitioners. And secondly, what the optimum environment, therefore, according to Montessori, was for a child to learn in. Although we have adopted a huge amount of what she wrote, we haven't adopted it wholesale, and there are reasons for that. But I think for today, if we just focus on what she wrote, just for the sake of narrowing the topic down, we can use that as a springboard into our own contexts. And I'm hoping not to speak for more than 20 minutes or so, because in the discussion time, I think it would be helpful for you to gather in groups of people who have a similar church environment to yours. We're very focused on the environment, not the content of the service. So the environment that worship is happening, not the content of the service. And so it would be good in the discussion time actually just to gather in groups of churches that have a similar environment. So my own context, Episcopal Church, largely, although we have a huge variation, but largely Anglo-Catholic worship, like you saw in the video there, with these kind of objects and things around. I know that's not true probably for most of you here. And so it's not. I'll lay down the principles based on my own experience and my own context, but we won't get stuck on that, because otherwise you'll go away with nothing helpful. In the discussion time, there'll be a chance to group up with people who have a similar environment to yours and talk about how all this might affect what you do in a worship space. So if we go on to the next slide and we talk a little bit about Montessori and the nature of the child. Here's what she said. We ought not to consider the child and the adult merely as successive phases of an individual's life. We ought rather to look upon them as two different forms of human life going on at the same time and exerting upon one another a reciprocal influence. And I've added the italics there, a reciprocal influence. Montessori was a devout Catholic, but in one fundamental way she really was challenging the Catholic teaching of her day, which was to do with the doctrine of original sin. At the time, most Christian teaching was that children are actually born sinful and need to be taught to be moral, they need to be taught to be good, and they need to be taught about God. I mean, in Britain, this was Victorian era, Montessori lived on the continent, but the similar principles were being taught. But conversely, Montessori really challenged that, because she believed that children were actually born innately good, which is something we're probably much more ready to think today, because our thinking has moved on. They're born with an innate morality and an innate sense of God, and that just needs to be nurtured and gently brought to its fullest expression. So children would learn morality and social responsibility through trial and error. It's not that they would never be naughty, and naughtiness would sometimes have to be curbed for safety apart from anything else. But so long as no one was in danger, Montessori strongly believed it was better to let children learn for themselves what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's moral, or otherwise. At the root of it was adults approaching children with a greater humility. That's what she was really pushing for. She felt that adults had become egocentric in their approach towards children, and this isn't something that we've totally thrown off now. For as much as we might believe children are very pure when they're born now, and our theology has moved on, we can still be very egocentric towards children. We interpret their behaviour in terms of how it affects us, and we just do it unconsciously. Ultimately, because as adults we tend to believe that we are the child's creators. We're created children, and therefore their behaviour has an impact on us. And Montessori reminds us, no, God creates children. And he puts everything in them to allow them to develop according to his plan. All the days for me were ordained for me before even one of them was written in your book. She was reminding society that children belonged to God and that God could use children to teach adults just as much as the other way round. It's this reciprocal relationship, two forms of humanity existing at the same time, not this idea that one is inferior and one is superior. A reciprocal relationship between the two. So if you go on. What she also wrote is, a religious person is one who can really love God and his fellow creatures. The child has that power when he is given the right conditions. This is the secret charm of childhood. What we have to do is to protect children so that this power is not lost in the process of growing up. And this fits in with the biblical model. I'm preaching to the choir here, and I know it. The boy Samuel in the temple hears God for himself, and Eli simply guides him as to what to do when that happens. The boy David had a prophetic ministry to King Saul. Jesus, when he takes the small child into the centre of the crowd, says the kingdom of heaven belongs to these, and we must become like small children to inherit the kingdom of heaven. So right through the Bible, children are credited with having this spiritual life of their own, which comes directly from God, and is not instilled in them by adults. So our role is not to teach children to be spiritual, but to allow them to be spiritual, and to expect to learn from their spirituality. But this is a reciprocal relationship, and the other side of it, which we're often more comfortable with, nevertheless, we can't forget it. We don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Children learn from adult spirituality. So everything we do in worship, how we worship, why we worship, it needs to be made accessible to them, and from the youngest possible age. And that's hopefully what we'll be getting into this afternoon. It's not about doing worship in a child's way with the adults looking on, and it's not about doing worship in an adult's way with the children looking on. It's about looking for a level playing field and sort of middle ground where, as much as possible, everybody has the opportunity to express their worship and learn from the worship of others. So, if you're feeling very theoried out now we'll get practical, and hopefully it will start to land in your own context and you'll think what use of all this might be for you. I want to talk a little bit about the practical changes we can make to church environments to allow this reciprocal relationship to go on. And as I said, I'll have to talk from my own context, which is the Episcopal Church. Lots of pews, high altars, lots of objects, lots of colour, lots of movement in our services. I know that's not true, probably for a lot of you here. In the discussion time, we'll try and land it in some other contexts too. And I'm here to learn from you as much as to give you what I've discovered so far in the course of my research and learning about how that looks. So I don't come with ready answers for every context, even for my own. So if you want to go on a slide. My husband and I were on a train recently, and I looked out of the window and I saw a car park that had some structural issues, a multi-storey car park. And I just sort of said to Alan, "Did you see that multi-storey car park?" And he heard Montessori car park, probably because I had my Montessori book that I was reading at the time. And this is what he had in his mind. There are a lot of misconceptions about Montessori classrooms and preschools, that it's all a bit go as you please, that it's a chaos environment. And actually that's not true at all, or at least it shouldn't be. For example, this, if we go on, don't know if you can see this, this is a church that's no longer a church and has instead had to be converted into a soft play centre to make use of the building. I once had an older lady in one of the congregations I work with accuse me of making the church into a soft play centre. And I thought of this and thought, how ironic. Actually, when you drive out young families, this will be what you end up with in the Episcopal Church anyway. This is the problem we face, is that our buildings, we just don't fill them anymore, and we don't need them. This, for Montessori, is not where children learn. Oh boy, do they like it. Oh boy, do they enjoy it. But she would see this as something that would bring out the very worst in a child's nature. Montessori and soft play centre don't mix. It's unbeautiful, it's artificial, it's unrealistic. You fall off or fall down in this place, it doesn't hurt, because everything is cushioned. Now what happens when I take my 2-year-old to a soft play centre is we get home, he starts jumping on the sofa, within 10 minutes he falls off, he bumps himself. Great for running off energy, not great for learning about reality. And Montessori was very focused on children having a natural learning journey that was based on the real world around them. So, she observed that the optimum environment for a child to learn in would actually be the following. Go on. So, it would be beautiful, it would be harmonious, it would be based on reality, and it would be filled with objects which promote learning, and which are safe for a child to explore and touch unsupervised or with minimal adult supervision. So it's a little bit like godly play, except obviously the children are still, but they're free to explore something their own way. It's not necessarily about giving them the answers. And within that type of environment, she felt that children would be able to self-select and focus on different things to learn from. That they wouldn't need an adult standing over them giving instructions saying, no, don't do that, don't touch that, it's not time for this yet. That wouldn't be required to keep them safe, to keep everybody comfortable. It was about constructing the environment around the child's needs. And she observed that learning and emotional well-being in children was much, much higher when they went together and when the child was in control of their choices in the learning environment. The other thing that Montessori observed was that movement and cognition were related. And we know this now. This is a pretty mainstream concept now, that children do literally learn more when they're moving around. So when we're teaching memory verses now, we so often do it with movement, because Montessori was one of the first people to observe that children literally learn more when they can move. So we've got this environment that's beautiful, that's harmonious, it's spacious so that the children can move around. And we're already starting to see how our church environments maybe do or don't correlate with that. And then we come to the objects, number 4 there, that are within that environment. Interestingly, Montessori was very against giving children toys. And she was defining toys as things which were designed to distract children from everyday life and keep them out of the way. Instead, she would provide them with miniature versions of the things that children would see adults using around them. So here it is. So this is a classic Montessori toy. Obviously, bearing in mind she lived 100 years ago now. Something that the child would see at home, mother sewing buttons onto shirts and things, and Montessori would provide a preschool child with something like this so that they could imitate it, because that for her was how children learnt about reality. Interestingly, how society has moved on, obviously I don't sew a lot of buttons onto things at home. When I give this to my 2-year-old, he turns it into Cranky the Crane. And I find myself wondering if 100 years ago, if he and I had lived and I had given him this, would he have sat and stitched the button on, or would he still see a crane? But this is the kind of thing that Montessori would like. Also that it's natural materials, the harmony, the beauty, all that was part of everything Montessori gave children. So here you've got a beautiful example of a Montessori classroom. Let me go back to the classroom. Yeah. You can see all the objects laid out for the children to self-select. Everything very, very tidy, very harmonious, very neat. And the other thing to notice there is the partitions. Montessori did divide children by age to some extent, not the way we do in schools now. It was more like, broader age ranges and a little bit more flexibility about when children moved up a stage. But the partitions between the age groups would only be waist high, and that was deliberate, and children were free to wander around if they wanted to. She felt it was very beneficial for younger children to see what they were going to be progressing onto, and also for older children to see what the younger children were doing, to come in and help them sometimes and also just to remember where they'd been, and perhaps if they were tired one afternoon, to come and do the simple activities that the younger children had instead of their own classroom activities. She felt that was really beneficial. And actually I think that is something that we're starting to incorporate into mainstream education again today. Right. Okay. So how does all this translate into church life? Well, Montessori lived in a world where children were usually in church alongside their parents, of course. It was really the late 1940s when we moved Sunday school to a Sunday morning in most church traditions. So she already had this issue that we have now of young children staying in church for the whole service that probably 50 years ago was less of an issue when everybody got shipped out to Sunday school, and that was expected. I've lost my place a moment. Right. So, because she already had this environment where the children were in church, she created something called the Children's Church. And here's how she describes it. Sorry, it's a lot of text on that slide. In which, the Children's Church, this place reserved for the faithful was made to suit their small proportions. We furnished it with little chairs and kneeling stools, and where she says we there, that's her and the children making it together. And we had a holy water basin placed at the knee height of an adult. Small pictures were hung low down and changed often according to the season of the year. Little statuettes represented the nativity, the flight to Egypt, etc. At the windows we hung light curtains which the children could draw to shut out the light. They took turns to prepare the church, to put the seats in place, to fill the vases with flowers, and to light some of the candles. So you can see behind me here, I'll move over now, I've got my own example of this. This is the diocesan play church. It's still a work in progress, it's still a prototype. People are gradually contributing different bits of it for me. It's all very Blue Peter, it's quite literally sticky back plastic, the wood. This is the Paschal candle, but it's yet to be painted. Thank you, sorry, that's clumsy. But it's a case of having safe and tactile versions of all the things that the children in our congregation are seeing on a Sunday morning. So they've got miniature chasubles, miniature vestments that are gradually being made by various seamstresses across the diocese in different sizes. We take communion every week, and our communion bread looks like this. So they've got different communion wafers, and even the big one that the priest uses for the visual display. Everything's wooden, everything's nice to touch and handle. There's a wee Bible, we haven't decided what we're going to put inside it yet. Candles, again, are safe to handle, so different candlesticks and things. Gradually people are donating me more and more bits and pieces for this. And when it's a little bit more complete, hopefully some people are going to do some artwork for me to hang up that the children can then change. And also we would normally have like an altar frontal, like a cloth, that changes the colour of it, and the Episcopal Church would change with the liturgical season. So I don't have any yet, but that's why there are different coloured chasubles if you're not familiar with the liturgical season. So the colour that the priest wears in the Episcopal Church changes through the year to represent different things. So yeah, this will hopefully go on tour around the diocese to different churches, just be placed in the church so that alongside the main service the children can interact and express their worship and copy what the adults are doing, but also work out what it means for them and how they want to do it. So they're playing, but it's a structured kind of play. Another slightly less involved version is down here. It's the liturgy box. Now this is, I raided my kids' toy box to create this. This is based on, if you just flick on a slide, there's a website called thespiritualchild.co.uk. Really handy if you are in a context like mine in particular. I think the lady that does this site is Catholic. But if you're in an Anglican, High Anglican, Catholic, or just a liturgical setting of other types, you may find quite a lot. And there are other things there that will translate into any context. So one thing she recommends is this thing called the liturgy box. And basically, this is a classic Montessori because there is quite a lot of parental input that goes into this. There's an instruction sheet for the service, and there's a different toy to represent each part of the service. So in our typical parish Eucharist on a Sunday morning, parish communion service, we'd have a welcome, we would have a prayer of confession, the Gloria, that's the praising God worship, the liturgy of the word, so our Bible reading and then the teaching that follows that, prayers of intercession, the creed, statement of belief, the offertory, obviously, where some churches still collect money during the service, most don't anymore, communion with the bread and the wine, and then the blessing and the sending out at the end. And there are different toys to represent all of that. So for the prayers of intercession, there's a phone. You see a wee children's Bible, pretty obvious. For the creed, the Anglican creed is tangled up. The Anglican creed is based on the Trinity. So this is a toy that everything is based on 3 things being one thing. So a bit abstract, but the creed is a difficult one for a 2-year-old. So that's the best we could do for the creed. And then we've got bread, grapes, it's actually an egg cup, but little chalice for communion, and a little purse for the offertory with some coins in there, nice big coins that are not swallowable, and things like that. And for the Gloria, for the songs of praise and worship, some ribbons to dance about. So that's the liturgy box. You're welcome to come and have a closer look at this at the end. And then, because I'm dealing with a lot of, how do I put it, older ladies who are a little bit, like I said, they've not had a lot of preschoolers in church for the last 2 generations. My generation are largely missing from the Episcopal Church. And so it's a bit of a shock to them. And when I start bringing in all these things, they can get a bit hostile because something's happening and, this is their church that they've worked so hard to make beautiful, and then I'm turning it into a soft play centre in their estimation. So we have a version of the liturgy box. Sadly, I don't have one made up. It's on Orkney. It's called the liturgy box. It's exactly the same thing, but all the toys are knitted. So what's happened, where I've been introducing it to a couple of churches where there's a little bit of hostility, is to actually come in and say, can anybody knit me one of these? And then once they've knitted it, do you want to keep it for your kids? And then it's there. It may never get used. They may never get any kids. But it's there. So that's just been a way of integrating that with the main congregation rather than just imposing something on them that sort of feels like it's coming in from the outside. They're generating this one. And the last one, I'm talking about preschoolers really today, but if you do have older children in this kind of context, the adults obviously have a paper service sheet with all our liturgy printed in it. Very difficult for a young reader. So all we did was just take the liturgy and create a liturgy booklet that's designed for a young reader. So there's a lot more colour. It's spaced out. I mean, this is pages long instead of very little thing. It's all spaced out with a lot more colour and pictures to show, so that a young reader, your sort of 7, 8, 9-year-olds who are, depending on where they are, starting to read fluently, can start to follow the service through and actually join in with the liturgy and the responses. So again, if you want a closer look at this, then just come and have a look after. So you're all totally theoried out now. Do you want to just before we break into groups, we've only got 10 minutes left. That went really fast. Does anyone just want to ask any questions before we split up? You've gone to sleep? Go on.
I just wondered about the principles kind of based on Montessori. I wouldn't agree that the child is innately, I think, that we're all born with sin. That would be something, that the church, that this is based on, that children would just have to keep them good, or what? I don't really get.
Yeah, so you're delving a little bit more into the theology of it there. Would you say that children are born with a natural spirituality?
I'd say that Christ pointed people towards a child's innocence and their ability to have faith, their ability to, tell them God is there and they'll believe you. They don't question stuff the way an adult would.
Okay.
But I think there has to be a time in somebody's life where they recognise that they were born a sinner.
Yeah. Okay. I think what we can agree on there is that children have an innate ability to respond to God that doesn't necessarily have to be instilled on them by adults. So if we just build on that, that's probably the most helpful for this session, if that's all right. So, yeah. Go on.
Yeah, Proverbs 22:6, train up a child the way he should go. At 20 years old, he will not depart from it.
Mm-hmm.
So, children are open-ended to do what they like.
Yeah.
And, I see with my 2 daughters, a 6-year-old, she definitely gets her cues from us.
Yeah.
As parents. Of course, freedom and worship of God is important and great, but we train her up.
Yeah.
The way she should go.
Yeah, and I'm right with you on that. So the point of this is to have it there instead of the toy box. Controversial. It's not, I'm not making that happen. I don't have that much success. But this is what Montessori was against, giving children toys, distractions, go as you please. It wasn't go as you please. It was go as you please within these very clear boundaries. And I think that's the misconception about Montessori, that it is about letting children run riot. But it isn't. It's about saying, explore this is safe. You can touch everything here. No one's going to get in your face about how you use it. That's why I don't actually think she would like the liturgy box. But that's, come from this website. But it's about giving children, like you say, training them up, giving them what they need to educate themselves with that freedom of movement and that freedom of choice that maximises their learning potential. I think with a preschool child, the more you limit their freedom of movement and the more you limit their choice, the more they stop absorbing.
I would agree with you to some extent in terms of they need freedom to be able to make choices, but they also need a structure. And I'm a speech therapist and I've been into nurseries and stuff, and I see how it's completely follow the child's lead, and some of the nursery teachers don't have a clue how to structure it. But in the same way, they need both, don't they? They need the. And I've just got to ask, how do you would you do this in the main service, where they're alongside the adults for the whole time, or would you have it as part of the service and then take them out, or in what way do you see it working in a service?
I think that the situation we have in the Episcopal Church is that there's no consistency on that. So the Episcopal Church I worked for previously, every service was an all-age service. Praise the Lord, that was great. But what happened was the kids were at the back with a load of toys, paying no attention. So what was the point? So it would be a case in that church of having this there, something like this, every service all the time, so that it's there for them to engage with. And then also, obviously, children get fed up with things, the same thing all the time. So is that thing of changing the hangings and the artwork and the objects that are there according with the liturgical season, just as we do as adults to keep our services engaging. So there's that aspect to it as well, that they're responsible for taking care of it. And that's another aspect of a Montessori classroom, that the children are responsible for taking care of it, for tidying up after they've used an activity. And that's something that often gets overlooked. One of the difficulties with Montessori is the name was never copyrighted or protected in any way. So a lot of nurseries and preschools slap the word Montessori on. They don't have a clue what it means. They don't know how to make it happen. They might have one or two Montessori-inspired activities, but they're not truly following the principles of Montessori. They're just using the name, and that's a constant frustration. So what's more helpful in the last 5 minutes? Is it to break into groups or more questions? Because in 5 minutes I wonder how far we could get in group work. But
I'd like to break into you.
Go for it, great.
The Baptist Church, which is not at all liturgical, and the creche is out of our centre room, it's just toys.
Yeah.
So I'd like to talk to somebody about how we could possibly make that less just toys and more.
Okay, so you're actually looking at changing your creche room rather than your sanctuary area, your worship space.
Correct, yes.
Right, okay. Okay, well, if you just go on to the next, can I just pick 2 more times? Sorry, well, the last slide anyway has 3 pictures. So it's 3 different, these are all Episcopal churches, which just shows you the kind of diversity I'm working with within the diocese. This is a lot like what you saw in the video at the beginning: fixed seating, pews, not much floor space, and not easy ways to make that space flexible. So let's say if that's your kind of context, maybe if you gravitate towards the couch and over here. This, a lot more like the church we're using today, and probably a lot more familiar to a lot of you. A church set up for a word-based service, so without a lot of the paraphernalia and with movable seating and lots of floor space. So if that's more you, maybe if we sort of stick to this area, and I should think that's probably most of you, so maybe if you group yourselves in 3s and 4s. And lastly, is anybody here in a cafe church style setup? No, then that's fine. We'll ignore the last one. But if you don't fit into either of these 2 categories, then just kind of go there and see what you get. And I've got a wee handout just to help you with the discussion. So.